Welcome to Trinity Baptist Church again this week. We're continuing our series of online services during this period of lockdown when we're unable to meet together. And we're also continuing the series that we began a couple of weeks ago, looking at Old Testament prophets. And if you remember, 2 weeks ago we looked at the story of Jonah, and last week we looked at Nathan the prophet. This week we're going to begin to look at the story of Elijah, and I say begin to look because this is going to be part one of looking at Elijah, and we're going to continue with another part of Elijah's story next week as well. So part one then of the story of Elijah, and we'll begin with just a bit of an overview of the person of Elijah. We're told that he lived in the northern kingdom of Israel during the reign of King Ahab, which was about during the kind of 9th century BC. And a bit like Nathan, who we looked at last week, we don't actually know a great deal of detail about who Elijah was, about his background. We don't have a story about his call, about how he comes to take on the role of prophet. In fact, this passage that we're looking at today from 1 Kings chapter 17 is the first mention of him in the Bible. And the only detail that we get about him is that he is a Tishbite. However, he goes on to become known as one of, if not perhaps the most famous, most important Old Testament prophets. In fact, in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 16, we're told that some at that time believe that Jesus is a second coming of Elijah. And then at Jesus' crucifixion in Matthew chapter 27, some of the bystanders there at the cross believe that Jesus is calling out Elijah's name, calling on him to come down and save him from the cross. Such is Elijah's reputation as the saviour of Jews in distress. And of course also Elijah appears in the story of the Transfiguration, which is found in chapter 17 of Matthew. Elijah appears there to Jesus alongside Moses, and he's there to represent all of the Old Testament prophets, such as his standing in the history in the nation of Israel. So despite the fact that he doesn't feature massively through the biblical narrative, in fact his story is told across just 5 chapters, nor the fact that we don't really know much about him at all, Elijah's importance in the whole kind of overarching story of the Bible can't be dismissed. And so, as I've already said, I think it's probably worth us taking 2 weeks to look at the person of Elijah, his story. And in particular, we're going to look at 2 incidents in which he features. And the first of those we're going to look at today is the very start, at the beginning of Elijah's story, which is found in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 to 16. And so if you want to pause me and go away and kind of read that story for yourself, now is probably the time to do that. At this point in history, the nation of Israel is divided into 2 kingdoms. It's divided into the northern kingdom of Israel, which is where Elijah lives and where our stories happen, and then the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, King Ahab's father, King Omri, had arranged a marriage of alliance between Ahab and Princess Jezebel, who was a priestess of Baal and the daughter of the king of Sidon. And this had brought security and kind of economic prosperity to Israel for a time. But it had also brought prophets such as Elijah into conflict with the royal family, as God sends them to deliver messages to the royal family, telling them just how they're leading the people away from God. Indeed, Elijah's first recorded act in the Bible is to confront Ahab to tell him that God is sending a drought because of the way that Ahab and Jezebel are leading the nation away from God. We're then told that God instructs Elijah to go and hide in a ravine so that he will have water to drink from the river. And God tells him that basically he's going to send birds each day to bring him food so that he'll have food to eat. Now I want you just to think about that for a moment. A drought means that there's going to be no crops, there'll be no harvest, there's going to be no food. And in the midst of that crisis, that food shortage, God is essentially asking Elijah to go and hide in the middle of nowhere and just to trust that these birds are going to arrive each day with food to keep him going. That sort of goes against our human nature, doesn't it? See, if we were to know that a food shortage was coming, if we know that essentially food is going to be scarce, in our country, then we would want to stock up, wouldn't we? And we saw that happen recently, didn't we, at the start of lockdown, as shops ran out of all sorts of things, from toilet paper, pasta, flour, baked beans. And that happens, despite what the papers might have you believe, that's not caused by kind of one or two people buying trolley loads of those particular products. It's caused instead by everyone, or probably most people at least, buying just one or two more of those items in their weekly shopping. Which, if we're honest, is probably a kind of sensible thing to do, and probably something that we have all done from time to time. Because, as I said, it's human nature to want to stock up in times of crisis. To have that kind of fear for what the future might bring and want to be prepared for whatever comes. However, I wonder if this story, as well as others in Scripture, such as the feeding of the 5,000 and God providing manna for the Israelites in the wilderness, if stories such as those might be telling us that it doesn't have to be that way. The theologian Leslie Newbigin says that church congregations serve as hermeneutics of the gospel, which in other words means that that the actions of the church interpret for the world the message of the gospel. The writer Will Sampson puts it maybe a little bit simpler. She says that Christianity includes an implicit call to embody our faith, to be that which we say we believe. And then in so doing, those around us see what it is that we believe. We interpret the gospel through our actions. Now, if that's true, then there's probably something of a disconnect going on, isn't there? When people who pray each week that we might be given our daily bread have cupboards at home full of enough food to keep a small army going for about a month. You see, if we believe that God is sufficient, that God will provide, then it has to impact how we view money and possessions and so on. You see, if it doesn't, if we still seek to amass more and more stuff, to build bigger and bigger barns, then what does that say about how we really view God and his ability to provide for us? I wonder if perhaps we need something of a reorientation. And maybe part of that might be how we think about the things that we have. Now, like me, you probably don't often think about God as being the provider of your bread or anything else. You see, we earn money, don't we? And then we go to the shops and we buy what we need. But there's a flaw within that thinking. You see, if I don't recognise God as the ultimate provider of all things, if I buy into the worldview that says that I earn everything I have, that it is mine and I provided it, well, then it affects how I see and how I am willing to use my money and my possessions and my time. And it affects how I see other people as well. It affects how I see them, especially those perhaps who don't have as much as I have. I wonder if we were converted from a paradigm of earn to a paradigm of gift, then might we be able to hold more loosely that which we have been given? And might we be more willing to share? I wonder if another part of the reorientation that is needed might be that we need to learn to be content with enough. Now that word enough is a kind of funny one, isn't it? Because I wonder how much is enough for you. Do you feel like you have enough, or are you still striving for more? Is enough just having food for today, having roof over your head, being able to pay your bills, just kind of getting by? Or does it mean something more? Does enough mean having some savings, something in reserve, enough to survive should something bad happen? And then if that is the case, how much is enough to have in reserve? Is it 1 month's salary, 2 months? Is it a year's salary? It's a hard one to judge, isn't it? And it's probably, if we're honest, different for each person. It's managed by our different circumstances. But ultimately, the point of this isn't to get you to examine your bank balances or to get you to judge other people on how much they save or don't save, but rather to point out that fundamentally, I think if we're honest, we all deep down crave more. We're kind of inbuilt with something deep within us, aren't we, that causes us to want what we don't have. And I think it kind of goes right back to the creation story, the story of Adam and Eve. They were living in an idyllic world where all their needs were met, including the need to converse in physical space with the God of creation. They didn't know what it would be like to want for anything. But yet, even in the midst of that, they still wanted for what? More. They wanted more, didn't they? They had all that they could possibly need, but yet they wanted more than just what they needed. They wanted what they could not attain without a breach in the relationship between God, humanity, and the created order. And this story, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of the fall, is absolutely a story that we too find ourselves within. You don't have to look very far to find examples of where greed, where that desire for more than is needed has caused devastation, where it has corrupted God's vision for his created world. And so then that leads us to a question: might there be a better way? As we read through the rest of this passage, we see that eventually the river runs dry, and Elijah is forced to move away from the ravine. And God speaks once more to him and tells him to get up and go to Zarephath, where he will find a widow who will feed him. Now, I wonder what he was expecting to find in Zarephath. I wonder if perhaps he kind of hoped that he might find a wealthy widow there with a full table to share a banquet with him. If that was the case, then he is sorely disappointed. As he arrives and finds the widow and asks for bread, she tells him that she's got just enough for one final meal for her and her son before they run out. And then once they've ate that, they will starve to death. Despite only having this meagre amount, she still agrees to share what she has with Elijah. And then we're told that as a reward for her act of generosity, God ensures that her jar of oil miraculously never runs dry. Now, at first glance, this story may seem to be something of an endorsement of a kind of prosperity gospel, that if we were to give just a little, we will receive much, much more in return. However, if we look more closely, we'll see that the widow does never receive riches. Each day there is still just the same amount, just enough for that one final meal. She doesn't receive great wealth from God, nor is she promised it, and nor does he promise it to us. But rather she finds that each day God provides just enough for that day. I wonder if, in order for us to truly find contentment in having enough, we need also to rediscover what it means to be radically generous. The writer Shane Claiborne says this. He says, true generosity is measured not by how much we give away, but by how much we have left, especially when we look at the needs of our neighbours. The widow in the passage literally shares everything she has, doesn't she? She doesn't just share from what she's got left over, which, if I'm honest, is how I share. I kind of look after myself first, and then if I've got something left over, I might think about giving. But instead, the widow literally shared everything she had. As I read that story, it reminds me of an incident within my own life. I used to volunteer when I lived in Sheffield. I used to volunteer in a soup kitchen there as part of a church team, part of the church that I was part of. And different churches around the city would take a night of the week each, and we would basically go down and set up our night. And our night was Monday. So we would go down Monday afternoon. Some people in the church, including some of the youth group that I led, would go down and make up sandwiches that we were able to take down into the city centre. And then we would take those sandwiches, as well as some flasks of hot drinks and soup, down and set up basically down there. And people who were living on the streets would come, and they would have the hot drinks or the soup there and then, and they would basically they would take away some of the sandwiches, which would keep them going then through the next day until the next night, when another church would come and provide more food for them. Now, this one particular night, we'd been down, as we always were, for about an hour and a half, and we had given away everything that we had. Our flasks were empty, our tables were empty, all the sandwiches had gone. And just as we were beginning to pack up, a guy turned up. Someone he came fairly regularly, and he came and he kind of ran in and said, "Oh, I really hope I'm not too late. I've come from another part of the city." Essentially, he'd walked miles to be there, and it had taken him longer than he thought it was going to take. And he turned up and he said, "I really hope you've got something left." And myself and the other volunteers, we kind of looked at one another and we looked at the tables and we thought, well, we don't have anything left to give you. And so some of us started to kind of put our hands in our pockets, work out if we had enough money to run to a supermarket to buy him something to eat. And as we were doing that, as we were kind of counting up what little money we might have to go and buy him something, one of the other guys, who was kind of one of the other guys there, who'd taken some food for the next day, essentially just tipped out his carrier bag, which had 3 or 4 sandwiches, which would kind of keep him going for the next 24 hours. He just tipped that out onto the table and said, "Take whatever you need." In that moment, just briefly, I think I kind of got a glimpse of what true radical generosity looks like. It looks like sharing everything we have, not just giving out of what we've got spare, not just giving out of what we've got left over after I've looked after myself. It looks like literally tipping out everything I have and saying, take what you need. Now, in our passage, the widow does that. She shares literally everything she has, and she is blessed by God for doing so. And I think we find that as we give, as we practice radical generosity, so we too are blessed. Not necessarily by material things, but we receive a blessing from God. Shane Claiborne again says this. He says, people who experiment in sharing may begin out of burden or guilt, but they are sustained by the matchless joy it brings. What delight it is to see others receive the gifts of God, especially when they have been deprived of them for far too long. So may we too be willing to share all that we have, seeing what we have as a gift from God and holding on to it loosely, that we might experience the contentment of having enough and the joy of seeing our neighbours have the same. And as we finish, I just want to share with you the prayer of St. Teresa. May today there be peace within. May you trust God that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May you not forget the infinite possibilities that are born of faith. May you use those gifts that you have received and pass on the love that has been given to you. May you be content knowing that you are a child of God. Let this presence settle into your bones and allow your soul the freedom to sing, dance, praise and love. It is there for each and every one of us. Amen.